Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today at Transform Your Sales Playbooks with Brain Science. It really is a combination of two of our favorite things, probably our favorite type of sales asset and our favorite topic. Presenting today is Shannon Balance, our CEO. And without any further ado, I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for taking time today on this topic. As Candy said, we are pretty passionate about it. And we have a lot to get through. So about myself, I was thinking this morning, how many sales playbooks have I seen in the last 5 to 7 years? And I thought, could it possibly be 100? I think it might, actually. And not only at Velo, where we help customers transform playbooks, but in my prior position, I ran a training and communications company. We worked with the Cisco's, the Walmarts, the HPs, and many of their sales training assets and playbooks. So this webinar is kind of a collection of my experience in viewing all of these sales playbooks over the last 5 to 7 years and the problems that we see in terms of creating and getting engagement and ultimately the business impact that we know you're after when you invest in this asset. So we're going to talk about some of those challenges. Then we're going to go into the topic of brain science. Personally, I believe that playbooks are really a self-learning tool, if you will, just-in-time reference aid. I know not everybody thinks of it that way, but when you look at the knowledge you're trying to transfer from a sales playbook, even if you don't want to attach a training word to it, it really is that important of an asset. So therefore, a little brain science comes in handy if you want your sales folks to actually remember and apply this information in a selling conversation. And then lastly, we'll look at some technology that I think is relatively new to the market in the last few years, and it's really making it possible to do things with sales playbooks that you couldn't do before, which ultimately will give your organization a better business impact. So let's get into some of the problems. So when I look at kind of the history of the playbooks, despite the people creating and being extremely knowledgeable and certainly understanding what a salesperson is like in nature, they're written for the wrong audience in most cases. So the audience is all wrong, and I'll give you a couple examples of that. Many of the playbooks we see are written as if they're kind of stuck in the 90s, in the 90s way of selling or the 90s way of how customers buy. And the landscape, it really has shifted. The third problem I see most common is the playbooks are static. PDFs, long documents. They're not dynamic, which the B2B selling process today is a very dynamic process. Fourth, no real objective. The most common objective we hear is we want salespeople to use it, or we want them to download it, maybe the only way it's being measured today. So it's very difficult to correlate an investment of, say, $50,000 to $100,000 in a sales playbook, which is pretty average, right, when you start to include the internal costs as well as if you're using any external help. So to not have a real business objective is kind of a shame. And then lastly, a maintenance plan. Playbooks are such wonderful assets. They have great information in them, but they get old and stale pretty quickly, and as soon as they do, your sellers lose confidence that they're even a good resource and stop using them. So we'll talk about that a bit. So first of all, you got your audience all wrong, right? And for those of you on the call with me, this may, of course, not be applicable to you, but perhaps it may be as well. So two examples of playbooks that I typically see: very dense, sometimes color, right? Links, inclusion, but typically very, very numerous in pages. Two playbooks came in this week, both over 100 pages long. Now think about your audience. When I ask people, okay, what's a salesperson like? How would you describe it? Now, of course, I'm generalizing, but one of the most common descriptors I hear is short attention span. So let's run with that for a second. If you have a short attention span, are you going to want to read a 100-page PDF? No. In fact, if you ask sellers, hey, if you get that new piece of IKEA furniture, are you just going to go and try and put it together, or are you going to read the instructions? Probably over 70 to 80% of them will say, no, they're just going to wing it and try and put it together, right? So reading a very long, dense playbook is not the typical go-to for most salespeople or the sales personality. And so then I went to look for, okay, what does a salesperson look like, right? And I thought, well, I'm going to get a picture of a quota club team. Those are the best of the best salespeople, right, that achieve or exceed quota. And I came across one for one of the fastest growing tech tech companies in the industry that went public 3 years ago, and this is what I found. And I thought, kind of funny, but this is a typical quota-exceeding sales team. And so when you think about developing your playbooks, you're developing a playbook for that audience. And they're all in kind of a leisure, happy mode at the time, right? They're celebrating being at Quota Club. But think about it when they're at the workplace. They're tethered to their phone, maybe their tablet. And so again, when they're looking for information in a playbook format, thinking about that workflow, thinking about their personality, how they like to get information, it's all very critical to getting good adoption of your playbook. So you're stuck in the 90s. This is a very common mistake we see with a lot of playbooks. And what I mean by this, you've all heard that customers do a lot of the buying process before they even get to a salesperson these days, right? 57%. We all do it ourselves. We're on the internet. We're looking, we're reading, looking at the competition, looking at the social ratings. We're reading all the product sheets. But most of the playbooks we see still concentrate the bulk of their content and their information in this part of the buying process the customer typically completes on their own. Now, it doesn't mean your salesperson doesn't need to know these things. They do. But if you really want to influence sales behavior, if you want to help them win more business, you need to concentrate more of your content in the second half, right? Once the seller is talking to the prospect about what the prospect wants to talk about. And what we need to see here to help sellers is real insights, right? Not just the product, feature, benefit stuff, because odds are the prospect might know that better than the salesperson at this point. What are other customers doing? Best practices. Lend that sort of insight to the buying process, and that's how they're going to add more value in that sale and have a better chance at winning that business. Playbooks are static. You've already heard me complain about the PDF format. I'm torn here because I also realize that you have to have a format that you can internally update easily, because if you can't, if it's too fancy and you can never update it, then that is going to be kind of the curse of your adoption. But the problem is the B2B buying process isn't static. It's actually really complicated. If we listen to our friends at Corporate Executive Board, this year at their conference, they told us there's now 6.8 people in the buying process. They call this the consensus purchase. I don't know if I'd use the word consensus. There's still usually an economic buyer, but there's definitely another 5 to 6 people at the table influencing whether that person buys or not, whether they're influencing positively or detracting from it. The salesperson needs to know how to manage those relationships and those conversations. But it doesn't just stop there. Then there's 5 to 7 sales stages. This is what we see across most of our customers. And it's usually 5 to 6, and the 7th one is kind of a close, one loss sort of thing. But you have to think about, all right, salesperson, I need to have multiple conversations with different types of buyers who each may have a different value proposition they're interested in across at least 5 stages of the buying process. Oh, yes, I might be selling in multiple verticals, and my company is now asking me to sell multiple products. The combination of each of these factors is a dynamic process. And as a sales rep, if I have to look through a 100-page PDF in some sort of linear fashion to piece together the exact scenario I'm looking for, it's just too much work. I'm not going to do it, except for maybe during the first couple weeks in my training when you mandate my training for me. But otherwise, you're going to be lucky if I even download it. The next one is, what is your objective? Now, I know this one is hard because if what you're offering or your resources available are really that PDF format and you put it up on a shared content system, the best you may be able to do is see, did the salesperson download it? But with some of the new technology, I challenge you to take it a step further. Can you form a SMART goal or objective around your playbook? Now, I'm going to show you an example of one that's fairly grandiose. I realize it's difficult, but I believe you can get here if you have an organization that supports you. I want to develop this new playbook to sell the Acme product, and I want to increase pipeline over the next 25% over the next 6 months of this product, right? You're probably using a CRM. You can measure pipeline activity. With some of the new technology, you're not only able to track when the seller uses that, but at each point in the sales stage or sales opportunity when they use your playbook to see what that engagement and useful level is. You can also start to track their competency. after a review of an initial playbook. And then, of course, you can now today correlate use of that playbook with pipeline opportunity in your CRM. And I'll give you some more examples of doing that later in the webinar. But don't be afraid to make your playbook objective SMART, even if you're just doing a baseline test. Perhaps you don't want to commit to your organization this lofty of a goal right out of the gate. Understandable. Walk into it. But you can certainly do more to get a greater impact from your playbooks by thinking along this business level. And lastly, maintenance. I think this is the bane of probably many product marketers' existence. It's a Herculean effort to get one produced, to get all the stakeholders involved, to get the best, most accurate information. Now, how do you maintain it? This is always tricky, especially if you're managing turnover and changes within an organization. And so we like to ask, how frequently does your information change? Is it weekly, monthly, quarterly? Perhaps it's a fairly static, mature product, mature market, and it doesn't change in years. But you want to think about this because it's going to influence your format, or at the very least, how much time you dedicate or allot to maintaining this resource over that measurable period. And when you package it up into an actual SMART sort of objective, it's easier to get management and budget buy-in to support it as more of a program versus just one random sales asset you're producing. So the second part of our webinar is the brain science. As I mentioned in my introduction, we view the playbook as a really important training aid. And I know a lot of our customers don't like to call it a training aid because that's a different group. That's a different department that does all of that. But when you think about the knowledge you're trying to transfer and the behavior you're trying to influence of your sales organization, this is one of your most powerful assets. It really is. So to not invest in it and to really think of some of the principles of how people learn and remember and apply information is really a lost opportunity. So let's talk about that a little bit. So I ask these questions. Do they remember what's in your playbook? Can they recall the information in a selling conversation? How about insights? Are they able to lend insights of a particular product or solution to that customer scenario? And then, is your playbook helping or expected to reinforce desired sales behavior, even if it's getting continuity among your sellers to position, qualify, and sell in a similar fashion? The answer is at least in 2 or more are usually yes. So by that definition, we look at this as influencing behavior and having some sort of training element to it. So how does memory work? We won't go into it a great deal here. We do have other trainings and aids if you're interested on the website. But at the highest level, memory begins with the process of encoding, right? And when you encode, before you encode, you first have to get someone's attention. You can't record the information in your brain unless you have their attention in the first place. So going back to our salesperson, what gets their attention? Well, it has to be either useful, right, entertaining, right? There has to be some reason in it to get their attention. It also needs to be short and in their workflow, something that they can get to pretty quickly when they're ready for that information. And only then, once you have their attention, does that encoding process begin, where it starts to transfer knowledge to the brain. But it doesn't just stop there, because once the encoding happens, we all forget. In fact, we forget most of what's encoded. But over time, hopefully, the important stuff starts to build up. And this increases this storage with more use. And the ways you can do that is repetition. Certainly, using that information and applying it immediately after is like supercharging memory. All of these things are really important, so when your seller goes to retrieve that information that's in your playbook, it's in their head, and they can apply it in a real selling conversation. That's when the rubber hits the road, right? Were they able to transfer that knowledge? Is it in their brain? Can they apply it in a real selling conversation? Because that's what's going to get you results. So how do we think about our playbook when it comes to attention, encoding, storage, and retrieval? Well, there are many factors that influence this. First is there has to be something in it to get their attention, right? That attention process. And sellers are at their peak of learning when they're motivated. And when they're motivated is usually right before they need to go have that selling conversation. And it could be as close as going up the elevator to meet the customer, right before they pick up the phone, before they respond to that email, right? And there's a fair amount of research that shows that the chemical activity in your brain, when you have a little bit of that anxiety or that high motivation, is one of the best times to learn. That's when some of this information is most sticky. So you have to take advantage of that. And by doing that, you need to be in the context or be part of their workflow. So if I'm a salesperson and I'm about to talk to the next person in the buyer's family, maybe I'm in stage 3 of the sales process, will I be able to access that component of the playbook that is most in context to me at that moment? Because perhaps I didn't remember it all, right? There's a lot of information in a playbook. And then is it in a short, relevant format for me? Because if I have to scroll through 100 pages to find the exact scenario of what I need, I'm going to be less inclined to do it. And even if I do find it, my brain is likely just to gloss over it because it's not in a small chunk. There's another study out there that we like to remember things in up to like 7 segments, 2 to 7, small chunks of information. Interactive. Research shows that if there's some interactive element to your playbook, to the process of gaining that knowledge, interaction about every 45 seconds, people stay engaged longer, which allows that encoding process to happen. And then is it repetitive? Can I get the information more than once? And think of it like your email box. If you get random emails from people you don't know, you kind of ignore them. You don't remember them. But let's say you get 100 emails from the same person. That repetitive nature is going to make you remember. So how do you bring all this together in a way that works for a playbook, right? Where you look at some of the things that are sabotaging the playbook's usefulness, you think about it in terms of the brain science, and now you apply some of the new technology. This is all possible. You can do this today. But there is a playbook format that we see, and here's just an example. Yours, of course, may be different depending on your needs and your industry and what you're trying to accomplish. But there's usually some sales intelligence, and this, again, should be geared towards the second half of the buying process. There's the marketing content, very important for engaging the prospects along the way. And generally, we see some section of internal know-how, whether it's how to use a CRM, steps to transferring the order or entering the order, different things of that nature depending on your business. If we want to take more of a dynamic playbook format versus a static PDF, it might look something like this. The cloud can be your friend when it comes to playbooks, whether it's Velo or another product on the market. But what we have here is we have the sales intelligence section, the marketing content, the internal know-how, and a pretty powerful search up top. So if I want the testimonial for XYZ company, I just have to type it in, and the case study with that testimonial is going to pop up for me. If I want to see, okay, what's the buyer persona journey for the healthcare market, boop, 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 it's going to pop up for me. So it's that dynamic mixing and matching of the scenarios that I need as a sales rep. And then behind each of these tiles, it's chunked, it's short. We recommend strongly you don't go over 5 minutes in total consumption time. This is about the maximum time a seller will engage before they shut off. And if you include content for consumption that's too much longer than that, then they start to lose confidence in your system that this is an easy go-to resource for them. So the more, when possible, you can chunk it, or at least chunk it and then link it to something else for more depth, the better engagement and overall trust you'll have in your system. So this is just an example of how you can take a playbook that may normally be in that static outline in a PDF and turn it into a much more dynamic, modularized format that's easy for sellers to access in the context of whatever they're doing. So we have the modern user experience, the content maps dynamically, and one of the other great benefits of using the cloud and some of these technologies for your playbook is it's trackable, measurable, and easy to update. Because you're able to see everything the seller is clicking on, what they're using, If you allow some of the pieces to be shareable with your prospects, you get that data too. So all of your case studies, your white papers, your data sheets that you know need to align with this buying process to support your sellers, you can add all this here. They have access to it, and again, you can see everything they're using. It's pretty handy. And the best part is, then you can start to add it even into their CRM workflow. So as they're changing out opportunities, they're changing sales stages of the buying process, boop, 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 it pops up. So everything that's applicable for healthcare at stage 3 for the VP of marketing, the system is going to recognize and grab those particular components of the playbook that are most useful to them, as well as the marketing content that they're likely going to need to share with a prospect over time. Now, in Vila's case, it actually gets smarter with more sales use, because it starts to learn, okay, 83% of the salespeople are using these 3 assets together in this like selling situation, boop, boop, boop. So that frequency of that pattern rises to the top. So you have to look at different playbook solutions. Some have a learning process included. Others will have kind of search and display. So you can certainly, you have choices out in the market, but still having it in the cloud and accessible to the seller is a great improvement over the PDF. And then what we love to see is, again, that kind of brain science bit built in. So on demand, capture it when they're motivated. If you have a sales force that's largely in the field, you need to make sure it's mobile ready. Are they able to get that quick battle card on their smartphone, on their tablet? Maybe it's their laptop, it doesn't matter, but it has to be in their workflow when they're most interested. Short chunked interactive. Here's just an example of where you might have text, audio, video. We're a big fan of using video as long as it's short, not too long. There's other things like flashcards, knowledge checks, so making it, again, interactive. You just have to be careful not to overuse the interactive, because then it needs to be simple. Ultimately, they're trying to get that information in a very quick time, hopefully to have a selling conversation immediately after, which is the great thing, because that's what you want. You want them to come back to this. You want them to reference it. That's how you build up that memory, and ultimately how you're going to improve their skill and win rates over time. Little brain science piece in here. So that's the intention, that's the encoding, and then, of course, the memory storage and retrieval. Simple concepts, but when applied all together, they make a dramatic impact. And then, as I mentioned, one of the great things about using the cloud technology is your ability to actually track and measure, which enables, gives you that real data for continuous improvement. You're no longer guessing. And this is what supports your ability to make some of those SMART goals. So if you do want to see the pipeline build for the Acme product by 25% over the next 6 months, it's now possible for you to actually formulate these goals, track them, and in the case of Vila and some of the other products, it'll actually build real time in your CRM, whether you have Dynamics or you have Salesforce or something else. So you can see salesperson is clicking on this asset at this stage of the sales process, and all of it starts to populate for you in real-time graphs. And then number 4 is really important too, at least in many of the products. It allows star ratings and comments from your sellers, which is great, right? Because otherwise you often are influenced in the development of your playbook by maybe a couple of the loudest voices on the sales team or sales leaders, but now you'll be able to see collective feedback across the board. And if you have a couple of really high-use assets that are used by 70+% of your sales force, but they're consistently getting a 2 rating out of 5, that gives you some important information to prioritize your updates and to see, how can you make this a better asset to aid your sellers in winning more business. So hopefully you walked away with a few things to think about and potential take-homes for improvement in your sales playbooks. We have some great information available online if you'd like to read our brief on playbooks for the 21st century. We have another science sales training. And then, of course, we have a webinar in January. We'd love to have you back, the Science of Sales Enablement. So anyhow, I hope you enjoy this, and thank you, everyone, for your time.